What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So this video is going to be in defense of Daniel Cormier and his commentary at UFC 323, specifically his commentary during the Merab fight. Now, I get why people are getting on his case about it, and I know that people like to dog on Cormier. They like to say he's one of the worst commentators. There's some reason why they say that. You know, it does appear to be the case by his own admission that he doesn't do much research. You know, he does unprofessional things like eat when he's like, you know, on microphone or being filmed. Like he clearly has a bias in favor of wrestlers and et cetera, et cetera. Now, on the one hand, I think people are just overly critical of commentators because it is a difficult job. I don't think people realize how difficult it is. And I think expecting someone like Cormier not to have a little bit of a bias for wrestling or expecting Joe Rogan not to have a little bit of a bias for jiu-jitsu is probably unrealistic. And I would just point out that like everyone hates on almost all of the commentators get some hate. You know, Bisping gets it, Cruz gets it, you know, Cormier gets it, Rogan gets it, et cetera, et cetera. Bas Rutten would get it, you know, like if they all suck, like where are the good ones? If it's so easy to be good at this, then where are the good ones? You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like refereeing. Like not all refs are equally good. Some of them are pretty bad. And some are more worthy of criticism than others. But even the refs people point to as being good, someone like Jason Herzog, you know, who is often pointed to, like Jack Slack calls him like the official referee of the Jack Slack podcast. Like someone like him, he's got scores of mistakes. You know, so if even he is messing up so consistently, like clearly this is just a really hard thing to be perfect at. So I kind of want to say that at the forefront. I think we're just too critical of these commentators generally. I don't think people realize how difficult it is to be there in person, watching the fight like cage side, which is not the optimal way to watch. You know, you've got the crowd, you've just got to be on for like, you know, 5 hours straight. And yeah, sure, like YouTubers will do live streams and shit, but that's so much less formal. There's so much less pressure. You know, you're so much more able to be unprofessional. Like it's just not, it's apples and oranges. Okay. So I want to say that. But with Cormier specifically, yeah, he doesn't do his research. Yeah, he loves wrestling. Yeah, he clearly has a misunderstanding of the judging criteria. Now, that gets complicated though, because to be blunt, like so do most of the people criticizing him, because most of the people I hear criticizing him for like favoring wrestling and control and takedowns and stuff, most of those people seem to think the criteria just means damage, that's all that counts is damage. And that's not it. And it's not even, you know, like I hear some people like say like, well, it's not damage. It's like stuff that could lead to a finish, you know? So that's why like submission attempts count too, and et cetera, et cetera. It's like, it's not even that, it's impact. Like impact is a word that's used, and impact, you know, yes, can lead, you know, can refer to things, you know, and there is language about grappling specifically and why, you know, grappling that has the potential to lead to the end of the fight. Like getting certain positions or going for submissions and stuff counts for more than just the position itself, like being in half guard or something. But like, yeah, there's stuff like that, you know, there's paragraphs of language there, but like there is a whole section about impact and how impact can mean damage, but it can also mean more intangible things like fatiguing the person and breaking their spirit and shit like that. And so this is like a kind of nuanced thing that leaves a lot of room for interpretation, I think deliberately so, and it is still kind of subjective, and people will criticize Cormier for saying like, well, it depends on how you value submissions versus valuing top control. And they'll say like, that shouldn't be the case. The rules say that one of those things counts for more than the other. And that's true, and that should be what he's saying, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, there's a degree of truth to what he's saying where, yeah, but is the judge going to see it that way? You know, because the reality is the judge decides, it is subjective, and it frankly never gets overturned. So it really does just come to what the judge prefers. And the judge might know that the criteria has been updated, but that judge may have been around for 15, 20 years in the sport and have biases from judging fights from like 2009 or something. And if that's your judge, then that's who's judging your fucking fight. And that's who's going to decide if you win. So in a sense, Cormier's right. It depends how the judge sees things. Because again, even if the judge doesn't see things that is maybe philosophically exactly to the letter of the updated rules, so what? Who's going to stop the judge from doing that? Nobody, because it's never going to get overturned. So in that sense, he's correct, I think. But what I really wanted to make this video about, though, is how it can be easy in a fight like Merab versus Jan 2 to kind of assume a certain narrative is playing out, even though it really isn't. And it reminds me of several other fights where that has happened, because it can be the case that someone is losing and that they ultimately lose the fight. So like they can be losing the early rounds and then they could ultimately lose the decision or get finished late or what have you. But for the first like half of the fight, you might be assuming they're going to win actually, because the fight is taking a shape that you think it will take if that person wins. And so like what I mean by that is you can look at someone like Justin Gaethje. So, like, if you watch Gaethje, especially his early career, his career before he had his first few UFC losses and before he sort of turned things around and got, became a top contender, got his multiple title shots. Before that phase, he was a brawler. And he was a guy who took shitloads of damage. He was a guy who got dropped, often in fights. And he was just willing to take the damage, and he would do more attritional damage to the other guy. He would chop down the legs and he would beat them up and he would just outlast them and he would knock them out instead of them knocking him out. And I remember watching his debut in the UFC against Michael Johnson, and I was actually watching it with my dad, and I've told this story before, but like Johnson is just hurting Gaethje constantly in the first round. And at multiple points did my dad say, "Oh, this is it, he's done." And I was like, no, like, maybe, like, he might get the finish here, but I've seen a lot of Gaethje's fights. This is kind of how they go. I won't be surprised if he turns this around. And of course, that's what happened. He comes back in round 2 and knocks out Michael Johnson. And if you watch this fight with Poirier, it kind of seemed like that was going to happen because it was looking like a Justin Gaethje fight. It was looking like a brawl. Gaethje was doing Gaethje things. He was landing hard punches. He was landing a ton of low kicks. And Poirier kept his composure, but you could see that it was like flustering for him. You could see that it was like stressful for him in a way where it was like, this is not the fight he's used to and prefers, whereas Gaethje was getting the fight that he preferred. So you're watching it play out and you're like, okay, this is going Gaethje's way, even though he was actually losing rounds and getting outstruck. Because in your head, you're like, okay, this looks like a Justin Gaethje fight. At some point, the tide will turn. At some point, the last straw will break the camel's back here, and Poirier is going to wilt and he's going to get finished. Like, at some point that will happen. Now, it didn't happen because the things Poirier was doing to win those rounds and his ability to actually keep composure, even though he wasn't having the fight he was most comfortable with, and the tactics he brought to the fight led to him getting the late finish instead. And another fight that I think of that kind of fits this mold is Israel Adesanya versus Jan Blachowicz, because Rogan and DC were doing commentary for that, and they were massively overstating the success that Israel was having on the feet. And, there was a few reasons for that. For one, it was like a slow-paced striking match, which, again, just fits what you would think. If you're going into that fight, you're thinking, Israel is the much better striker. This is kind of what his striking matches look like. If Jan wins, it's either going to be a knockout because he's the bigger man and he's got the Polish power and everything, or he's going to out-grapple him. But he's not going to outpoint him on the feet. That just isn't a likely outcome going into that fight if you're making a prediction. And then you saw certain things where Jan was reacting very visibly to all the feints that Israel was throwing out at him. And so you pair these things together and the fight is going on. We're entering rounds 2, 3, and 4. And Rogan and Cormier are making it sound like Israel's winning when he wasn't. And he didn't just lose because he got out-grappled, which he did, but he also lost a lot of the exchanges on the feet. And it was just a mix of the fact that it looked like a fight Israel should be winning, and Jan was kind of overreacting to the feints, but the latter didn't really matter because he wasn't making any grievous errors. Like Stephen Thompson talked about it after the fact. He's like, look, yeah, Jan he's doing this kind of stuff. He's reacting and flinching, and his hands are moving, and his head is moving anytime Israel does anything. But he's not getting out of position in terms of he's not getting his head way out of where it should be. His feet aren't getting out of where they should be. He's not countering at things that aren't there. He's not doing stuff that actually gives Israel an opportunity to capitalize. It's just bad body language more than anything. And yeah, Jan was doing good work. He was working the lead hand, and he was getting a lot of the striking exchanges going his way. He simply was. It's just hard to see it in real time because in your mind, you're like, this is my idea of how this fight goes if Jan wins, and this is my idea of how the fight goes if Israel wins. And it was looking optically more like the fight should go if Israel is going to win. It just actually wasn't. Just like with the Poirier-Gaethje one. Like, this is kind of looking like a Gaethje fight, so I expect him to ultimately win, but that's not what happened. It was actually going Poirier's way, and he did come out on top in the end. And a similar one, but in reverse, is when Gaethje fights Ferguson. And I've heard other people make that comparison too, but I felt the exact same way, where, because you're going into that, and a lot of people are saying, okay, Ferguson is the more durable guy of the two. He's the bigger guy of the two. He has the better cardio of the two. Like, if they get in a protracted war, and Gaethje doesn't just knock him out early, because Gaethje was also part of his technical turnaround during this phase was that he was suddenly knocking dudes out in round one. Guys like Cerrone and Barboza and Vic. And, so people are thinking, okay, he's either going to knock Ferguson out, or if the fight goes longer, it will favor Ferguson. And the fight was starting to get protracted, and Ferguson dropped him with an uppercut at the end of the second round. So you're watching this, and you're like, okay, this is turning into a Ferguson fight. This is going his way. This is great. But as the fight went on, you start seeing, oh no, actually, Gaethje is just beating the shit out of him. Gaethje is getting the better of all of the tactical engagements, and he's not going away. And that turned into a prolonged beating and ultimately a late finish, where Ferguson was finished and Gaethje won. But again, I can forgive you as a viewer and as a commentator if, up until the halfway point or something, you're looking at this and saying, yeah, I think Ferguson's winning. Just like I can forgive you if you watch some chunk of that Israel Adesanya-Jan Blachowicz fight and think, okay, this is an Israel fight, he's winning. Or if you're watching the Poirier-Gaethje fight and you watch the first couple of rounds and you're like, okay, he's taking his licks, but this is looking like a Gaethje fight. I think he's going to win. And again, you watch the Jan fight, or the Jan and Merab fight, and it's rounds 1 through 3 were close. I know some people are, debating who, did Merab win round 1? And most people think he did. And did he or didn't he win round 2? And is it crazy that he won round 2? Is a 50-40, 45 for Jan more fair or not than a 48-47 for Jan? All that kind of shit. I'm not going to, weigh in on that. But rounds 1 through 3 are close. And sure, there were signs that this was not going well for Merab. Not least of which, of course, being the moments of extreme damage that happen in most rounds where he'd either eat a big shot or he'd get hit in the body and visibly respond to it. But there were things that were encouraging. He was still attempting a shitload of takedowns. He got some good offense going on the feet. Again, he rocked, he hurt Jan in the first round with the right hand. I think it's round 3 where he actually picks Jan up and carries him across the cage. And it's if you're watching that live, it's okay, in your head, you're okay, this might be the tipping point. This is where it starts really looking like a Merab fight. This isn't new for Merab. Rounds 1 and 2 against Umar were really close and he might have lost them. It's this is not uncharted territory. This is not uncharted waters. And you would think if he wins round 3 and if he wins round 4 and 5, he's good. And even if he loses round 3, if he just cleans house in rounds 4 and 5, he just needs the judges to give him round 1 or 2, and he's good. So so in your head, you're okay, this is looking like a Merab fight. But of course, that's not what happened. Jan only did better in rounds 4 and 5, and again, he arguably won rounds 1 through 3, or at least 1 or 2 of them, depending on how you see it. But so again, yes, Cormier does bad research. Yes, his understanding of the judging criteria is dicey at best. Yes, he has a strong bias for wrestling, but I can see why you would be watching that fight and have a sense of how does this look if Merab wins? How does this look if Jan wins? Is this starting to take a shape of a Merab fight? I think it is. I can see him winning this. Especially if you already know, sure, ordinarily you're not supposed to score holding the guy against the fence and getting a brief takedown where he lands on his butt and gets right back up and et cetera, et cetera. Sure, that stuff is not supposed to score that much, but it does in a Merab fight because it wilts the guy. It exhausts the guy. I've covered this in previous videos how the individual pieces of what Merab does shouldn't actually score for much, but when you add it all up, it's greater than the sum of its parts. Because again, talking about impact, talking about wilting your opponent, talking about taking them where they don't want to be, that's what Merab does. So like, you're seeing that shit happen in the early rounds against Jan, and yeah, like it shouldn't actually score for more than what Jan is doing, and it ultimately didn't, but like, I can see where you would watch that and say, this is what happens. This is going to add up to a round 5 where Jan is just broken and Merab is emoting on him, and it's going to end in a Merab decision. Like, that's where this is going. That's the story we're watching being told. We're just at chapter 1 right now. I can see where in your head that's how you would see it. And it would take time. It would take the unfolding of the fight for you to slowly realize, like, oh, fuck, like, Jan is doing this. This is happening. Like, he's actually pulling this off. The Merab train is getting halted here. Like, he actually looks pretty fresh, and Merab just keeps getting hurt and hurt and hurt and beaten up, and these body shots are adding up, and et cetera, et cetera. Like, that, I think it's fair for a commentator to not catch up to that immediately, especially, you know, it's all the harder, again, when you're doing it live, and you have to talk the whole time. Like, you should almost expect a delay and them figuring out what's happening. Yeah. And people will joke about that. Like, when I watch the fights with my friends and shit, half the time we'll call something before the commentary, and often with like a 3-second delay, where it's like, we'll call something like, he was going to go for whatever, like he was going to go for a spinning kick there, or he's setting up the body shot, or he's doing this, or he's looking for the takedown right now, or yada yada yada. And often we'll say that, and then like 3 seconds later the commentator will say that, and then we all make the same stupid joke that, like, oh, we could have their job. And it's like, yeah, but that's just us hanging out on the couch and just watching the fights. You know, it's a different situation. So to tie this all together and to wrap it up, like, is Cormier the best commentator? No, not remotely. Does he have his problems? You know, does he not do enough research? Yes. Does he misunderstand the scoring? Yes. Does he have a bias for wrestlers? Yes. You know, I still like the guy. He's one of the greats in the sport. I think we all like him in other contexts. Like when we watch him training with Khabib, or when we watch him interview fighters one-on-one, we all love him. It's just his commentary isn't the best. But in general, though, I think we are far too harsh on the commentators. And in a fight like this, you know, I think people need to appreciate the fact that, like, it's reasonable to have certain ideas in your head of how the fight can go and how those different paths can favor one fighter over the other, and how you can ultimately be proven wrong about that, but it takes time for you to realize that's what's happening. It takes time for you to realize, oh, even though this looks like a fight that would favor this guy, even though this is taking the shape of a fight that this guy normally wins, it's actually not going his way, and it's actually not going to ultimately lead to him winning. It's going to lead to the other guy winning. So that's all I got on that. I think people need to bear that in mind. I think that's an interesting dynamic in fights in general. And I think people need to be a little more forgiving of the commentators. So there you go.